Stress is a learned response. Consider this carefully before anything else. What you call stress does not arrive with events. It appears after your mind has already agreed to a certain interpretation. The body tightens only after judgment has been made. The pressure you feel is not embedded in the situation itself. It is produced by how you have been trained to read what happens. Events are neutral. A message arrives. A plan changes. Someone delays. None of these contain stress on their own. Stress begins when the mind labels the event as harmful, urgent, or intolerable, and then consents to that label without examination. That consent happens quickly, often invisibly, and then it repeats. Over time, repetition becomes habit. This is why stress feels automatic. Not because it is inevitable, but because it has been practiced. The mind has learned to assent in a particular way, at a particular speed, under familiar conditions. That training may have come from work culture, family patterns, or personal fear. Its origin does not matter. Responsibility does. Stoic discipline refuses to comfort you by blaming circumstances. It also refuses to accuse you. It simply states the mechanism. Disturbance is not caused by what occurs, but by the judgment you add to it. If judgment creates disturbance, then judgment can be examined. If it can be examined, it can be trained. This is not a promise of ease. Life does not slow down for philosophy. But clarity changes where pressure is generated. Notice this carefully. Stress begins with misplaced ownership. Everything that follows depends on one clear distinction. Stress grows when you take ownership of what was never yours to command. The mind reaches outward, assumes responsibility for outcomes, reactions, timing, and approval, and then feels burdened when reality refuses to comply. What you experience as pressure is often the result of carrying authority where none was given. There are only a few things that belong to you in every situation. Your judgments, your intentions, your choices, your responses. These are always within your command. Everything else, the actions of others, the pace of events, results, recognition, and reputation, arrives from outside. They can influence you, but they do not belong to you. Stress appears when this boundary is ignored. You answer a message and wait for a reply. The silence begins to feel heavy. Nothing has happened. No harm has occurred. But the mind quietly assumes responsibility for the other person's timing and reaction. You begin to monitor what you cannot control. That monitoring produces tension. The tension is labeled stress. Or consider work. A task is assigned. You are responsible for your effort, attention, and care. You are not responsible for how it will be received, whether it will be praised, or whether conditions change afterward. When you try to manage all of that internally, the mind never rests. It believes it is guarding something fragile. The result is constant alertness without authority. This is not diligence. It is confusion. Stoic discipline begins by returning responsibility to its proper place. You are accountable for how you judge what happens. You are not accountable for the world arranging itself to your preference. When these domains are blended together, effort turns into strain. When they are separated, effort becomes clean. Stress is often described as having too much to handle. More precisely, it is handling what was never yours. The mind keeps rehearsing scenarios, anticipating reactions, defending imagined outcomes. None of this improves your capacity to act. It only increases internal noise. Notice how quickly ownership expands. A single inconvenience becomes a narrative about competence, security, or future loss. The event remains small. The judgment grows large. This expansion is not forced upon you. It is something the mind has practiced. This is why stress feels personal. It feels like a failure to cope. But the Stoic view is different. It is a failure to distinguish. You are treating external variables as if they were internal duties. That mistake would exhaust anyone. Returning ownership does not mean disengaging from life. It means acting precisely. You still prepare. You still plan. You still care. But you care about what is yours to carry. You release what never was. When an outcome matters to you, effort should be focused on the quality of your choice, not the guarantee of a result. When attention drifts toward securing outcomes, stress follows immediately. The mind tightens because it senses risk without authority. This distinction explains why stress persists even when circumstances improve. You can change environments, roles, or routines, and still feel the same pressure. The habit has not been addressed. Ownership is still misplaced. Stoic discipline does not ask you to become indifferent. It asks you to become accurate. Accuracy reduces unnecessary strain. It restores proportion. It allows action without internal resistance. Once this boundary is seen clearly, something changes. You stop arguing with reality internally. You begin to reserve judgment until it is needed. The mind no longer runs ahead trying to manage what it cannot reach. This explains where effort is misplaced, but not yet how disturbance takes hold, the moment you agree with the impression. Now we look at what actually creates disturbance. What reaches you first is not stress, but an impression. A sound. A message. A facial expression. A delay. These arrive without asking permission. They are automatic. The Stoics never claimed otherwise. The mistake begins when the impression is treated as a verdict rather than raw data. An impression says, "This is bad." It says, "This is urgent." It says, "This threatens something important." None of that is yet true. It is only a proposal. Between the impression and the feeling you call stress, there is a small, often unnoticed step. The mind agrees. It assents. It says, "Yes, this impression is accurate. This matters in the way it claims to matter." That agreement is what converts sensation into disturbance. This point is where freedom exists. Impressions are involuntary. Assent is not. You may not control what appears in your mind, but you always control whether you accept it as true. This is not a metaphor. It is a mechanical description of how judgment works. Consider criticism. Someone makes a brief comment. The impression arises immediately, "I am being diminished." Stress follows almost instantly. But notice the sequence. The words themselves do nothing. The tension arrives only after the mind endorses the interpretation that status, competence, or security has been threatened. Or consider delay. You are waiting for something to move forward. Time passes. The impression says, "This should not be happening." The body tightens. Irritation builds. But the delay itself is neutral. Stress enters when the mind agrees that the delay is unacceptable, harmful, or personal. In both cases, the feeling seems unavoidable because the assent is fast and practiced. It happens so quickly that it feels like part of the impression itself. But it is not. The Stoics were precise here. They did not deny emotion. They denied confusion. Feeling arises after judgment, not before. You feel pressure because you have already decided something important is at stake and out of control. This is why telling yourself to calm down fails. Calm is not a command. It is a result. The cause is judgment. If judgment remains unquestioned, the emotion will return. The critical skill is not suppression, but delay. A brief pause before assent. One breath is enough. In that pause, you do not argue with the impression. You simply refrain from agreeing with it. This is an impression, not a conclusion. That sentence, held silently, is discipline in action. Most people believe stress comes from caring too much. In reality, it comes from agreeing too quickly. The mind rushes to protect imagined stakes without checking whether they belong to you or whether they are real at all. Notice how often the impression speaks in absolutes. This must be fixed now. This cannot go wrong. This means something about me. These are not facts. They are habits of interpretation. Assent gives them power. Without assent, the impression passes. With assent, it becomes a story. The story demands emotional energy. The body responds accordingly. Stress is simply the physiological echo of a mental agreement. This is not a call to become passive. Action still follows. But action taken without panic is different in quality. It is cleaner, more effective, less costly. The pause before assent is small, but it is decisive. It is the only point where you are not being carried by habit. At that moment, you are choosing how reality will be interpreted. Most stress is not caused by severe events. It is caused by repeated, unexamined assent to ordinary impressions. Over time, the mind trains itself to agree automatically. That automatic agreement is what feels like inevitability. But inevitability is an illusion produced by speed. When speed is reduced, choice reappears. When choice reappears, training becomes possible. Understanding the mechanism is not enough. It must be trained. Discipline is the training of attention. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. Discipline is not force. It is not pressure applied to yourself. It is not endurance, suppression, or clenched control. Those approaches rely on strain, and strain collapses under repetition. What you call discipline fails because it is treated as an emergency response instead of a practiced skill. Stoic discipline is training. Specifically, it is the training of attention. The mind is always attending to something. An impression appears, and attention moves toward it automatically. Discipline does not try to stop this movement. It teaches attention where to rest before judgment is given. Over time, attention learns to pause instead of rushing forward. This is why willpower alone does not work. Willpower is episodic. It appears under pressure and disappears when tired. Training is different. Training operates before pressure arrives. It reshapes the default response. If stress is a habit, then discipline must also become a habit. Most people attempt discipline only when they already feel overwhelmed. At that point, the nervous system is active, the impression feels urgent, and assent has already occurred. Trying to intervene there is like trying to correct posture while falling. Possible, but unreliable. Stoic practice intervenes earlier. It begins with repetition and low-stakes moments. Small delays. Minor frustrations. Ordinary inconveniences. These are not distractions from practice. They are the practice. When a trivial delay occurs and the mind produces its familiar judgment, that is the training ground. Not because the event matters, but because the mechanism is the same. The impression proposes urgency. Attention tightens. The habit is ready to repeat itself. Discipline asks only one thing: do not agree yet. This is not suppression of emotion. Emotion will still arise. The body may still react. Stoicism does not promise numbness. It promises clarity. The difference is that clarity allows response instead of compulsion. Training attention means learning to notice the impression without endorsing it. You observe the thought as a thought, not as an instruction. This creates distance. Distance creates choice. Over time, something important happens. The pause becomes familiar. The mind stops treating every impression as a command. It learns that nothing bad happens when assent is delayed. The urgency dissolves on its own. Stress loses its authority. This is why discipline feels quiet when practiced correctly. There is no internal shouting. No dramatic resistance. Just a steady refusal to rush agreement. Repetition matters more than intensity. A brief pause practiced many times is more effective than a heroic effort practiced once. The mind learns through frequency, not persuasion. This training must occur when you are calm, not only when you are strained. Otherwise, you are rehearsing panic instead of restraint. Every unexamined assent strengthens the habit you are trying to weaken. Every delayed assent weakens it. The Stoics called this ascesis, training. Not moral performance. Not self-punishment. Training the mind to remain available to reason under ordinary conditions. Discipline does not remove difficulty from life. It removes unnecessary resistance. When attention is trained, impressions lose their ability to hijack judgment. Stress no longer arrives as a reflex. It becomes optional. This is not achieved once. It is maintained. Just as physical conditioning fades without use, mental discipline erodes when neglected. There is no finish line. Only practice. When discipline is understood this way, it becomes practical rather than idealistic. You stop waiting to feel disciplined and begin acting with precision regardless of mood. Training remains abstract unless it appears in daily life, where practice meets the ordinary day. This practice is proven in ordinary moments. Stoic discipline does not wait for crisis. It operates in what seems insignificant. Small delays, minor friction, routine interruptions. This is where habits are either reinforced or retrained. If practice does not appear here, it will not appear when pressure increases. There are 3 quiet practices that anchor this training in daily life. None are dramatic. None require special conditions. Each targets the same mechanism: impression, judgment, assent. The first is anticipating impressions without anxiety. At the start of the day, you acknowledge what is likely to occur. Delays, misunderstandings, imperfect responses from others. This is not pessimism. It is accuracy. You are not imagining disasters. You are reminding yourself that ordinary friction is part of human activity. When the impression later arrives, it feels familiar rather than shocking. The mind is less likely to rush into judgment because it recognizes the pattern. Stress often comes not from difficulty, but from surprise. Anticipation removes the element of surprise without creating fear. You do not say, "This will be terrible." You say, "This is likely." That distinction matters. The second practice is pausing before assent. When an impression appears, you take one breath before agreeing with it. Nothing more. One breath interrupts speed. Speed is what gives impressions their authority. Slowing down weakens that authority immediately. In that brief pause, you do not debate the impression. You do not correct it or replace it with a positive thought. You simply withhold agreement. This is an impression. I will decide what it means. Often, that is enough. The urgency fades. The body settles. Action can proceed without tension. If the situation still requires response, you respond with clarity rather than reactivity. This pause is not visible to anyone else. It does not change your external behavior. It changes your internal posture. Over time, the pause becomes automatic. Stress loses its speed advantage. The third practice is evening review without guilt or praise. At the end of the day, you briefly review moments where assent was rushed and moments where it was withheld. You do this without self-attack and without congratulation. Both are distractions. Guilt is just another unexamined judgment. Praise can become one as well. The purpose of review is accuracy, not evaluation. You note patterns. Where impressions reliably provoke agreement. Where the pause was forgotten. Where it appeared naturally. This information guides tomorrow's attention. Training requires feedback. Quiet, factual feedback. These practices work together. Anticipation prepares attention. The pause interrupts habit. Review refines awareness. None of them require perfect execution. They require repetition. Stress weakens when it is no longer rehearsed. Each time you delay assent, even briefly, you interrupt the pattern. Over time, the interruption becomes the default. Life does not become easier. Demands remain. Uncertainty remains. What changes is where the pressure is generated. It no longer comes from inside your own judgment. This is why Stoic practice feels stabilizing rather than calming. Calm is an emotional state. Stability is structural. It depends on where authority is placed. When practice becomes consistent, something subtle appears. You begin to feel less compelled to manage outcomes internally. You act, then release. The mind stops bracing against imagined futures. Energy becomes available. This is not detachment from life. It is engagement without internal resistance. Consistency produces a different result. What freedom remains under your command? Freedom is often misunderstood. Most people associate freedom with comfort, ease, or the absence of pressure. They imagine that if conditions were arranged differently, fewer demands, better timing, more cooperation, freedom would follow. Stoic discipline rejects this definition entirely. Comfort depends on circumstances. Freedom does not. What remains under your command is not how life unfolds, but how your mind meets it. Life does not become simpler when discipline is practiced. Obligations remain. Uncertainty remains. Loss and inconvenience remain. What changes is not the content of experience, but the location of authority. Authority returns inward, where it belongs. Inner freedom means that no impression is allowed to rule you without consent. It means you retain the ability to decide what matters, how much it matters, and what response is appropriate. Nothing outside you must change for this to be possible. This freedom is quiet. It does not announce itself. It appears as the absence of unnecessary urgency. Situations still require action, but action is no longer driven by panic or internal pressure. You do what reason requires, then you stop. Many people mistake relief for freedom. Relief is temporary. It depends on problems resolving. Freedom persists even when problems remain unresolved. That persistence is its defining feature. When stress has been trained away as a reflex, you notice something important. You are no longer negotiating internally with every event. The mind stops asking, "How do I make this safe?" and begins asking, "What is mine to do here?" That question is answerable. Freedom is maintained, not achieved. There is no permanent state where vigilance can be abandoned. Assent remains the point of responsibility every day. The difference is that the practice no longer feels foreign. It feels normal. This is why Stoic freedom does not feel dramatic. There is no emotional surge. No sense of triumph. Just steadiness. Just proportion. You may still feel emotion. Discomfort does not disappear. But emotion no longer dictates judgment. It informs without commanding. That distinction preserves dignity. Nothing outside you can remove this freedom. Someone may insult you, delay you, misunderstand you. None of that forces assent. The capacity to withhold agreement remains intact unless you surrender it. This is also why freedom cannot be given. Advice cannot install it. Circumstances cannot produce it. It is practiced, moment by moment, through accurate judgment. The world does not need to cooperate for this to work. It often will not. Stoic discipline does not bargain with reality. It meets it as it is and retains sovereignty anyway. When this becomes clear, stress is no longer treated as an enemy to eliminate. It is treated as a signal. A sign that assent was given too quickly, or ownership was misplaced. That signal guides correction rather than frustration. Freedom is not the absence of disturbance. It is the ability to return to reason when disturbance appears. That return is always available. Nothing more needs to be added, keeping responsibility undivided. This ends where responsibility begins. What you call stress was never an external force pressing inward. It was an internal habit reaching outward. A trained reflex of judgment, repeated so often that it felt automatic. Seen clearly, it loses its authority. Nothing here requires escalation. There is no need to battle thoughts, control emotions, or manage the world more aggressively. The work is quieter. It consists of returning responsibility to where it belongs and refusing to carry what was never yours. Events will continue to occur without consulting you. Impressions will continue to arise without warning. This is not a failure of discipline. It is the condition of being human. What remains within your authority is whether you agree with what the impression claims. Responsibility cannot be outsourced. Not to circumstances. Not to other people. Not to habit. When judgment is rushed, disturbance follows. When judgment is withheld, freedom remains intact. This relationship does not change with experience or age. It only becomes more visible. There is no expectation of perfection here. You will assent too quickly at times. You will feel tension return. That is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that the mechanism is still operating. Correction begins the moment it is noticed. Stoic discipline does not promise relief from difficulty. It offers something more durable. The ability to meet difficulty without surrendering sovereignty. The capacity to act without internal resistance. The steadiness that comes from knowing exactly what is yours and nothing more. The habit of stress dissolves not through insight alone, but through repeated, ordinary restraint. Each pause before assent matters. Each accurate judgment weakens the old reflex. Over time, the trained habit is replaced by a trained clarity. This work does not announce itself. It does not produce visible milestones. It is maintained quietly, through attention, day after day. That maintenance is the discipline. The work is simple. It is not easy. And it is yours. Return to what is yours.